Dungeon Quest currently has 16 mainline dungeons, ranging from Desert Temple all the way to Yokai Peak. And in this video, I'm going to be ranking every single dungeon from worst to best. And beginning our list, we have the Underworld, which could be the most basic, uninspired dungeon to have ever released. Yeah, I really think that there's no secret why this dungeon was put at last place. While the enemies and bosses are a huge step up from other dungeons, this map really suffers from a lack of detail, and the map really seems to just have a lack of personality to it, and almost just feels like empty. Yeah, this dungeon really is just not great. The bosses and enemies are very fun to fight, however the map is just so poorly made that it just ruins the entire thing for me. Yeah, even in just this area right here, I could probably count like just 12 different parts that they use. Also, I think the textures are just very dirty and not fun to look at whatsoever, which is definitely my biggest complaint with this dungeon. However, another huge complaint that I feel like most players would have is the amount of walking you have to do in this dungeon. This dungeon actually did not have any speed spells, so getting from area to area is extremely boring, because you can even see with my speed spell, I have to walk all the way through here just to fight the final boss. So this is why me and many other players put this at the worst dungeon in all of Dungeon Quest. And for rank number 15, we have Pirate Island. Now I want to say that this ranking is made mostly from my own personal opinion, however I do consider other people's opinions and other fair criticism. With that being said, Pirate Island is the second worst dungeon in all of Dungeon Quest, and I think the main reason is how the bosses and enemies function, with their attacks being very predictable and very basic. And while I do think the map aged relatively well, I think this cave section really just lacks detail and has similar issues to a dungeon like the Underworld, where just looking at these textures, it's just so basic and so boring. I really think that if so much of this dungeon wasn't a cave section, it would have been a lot better, because the outside sections are actually really fun to play. And I know that this dungeon did get a little bit of a lighting rework to help fix it up a little bit, but in my personal opinion, that only just kind of made it worse. I really think that similarly to the Underworld, the idea to this dungeon is cool. However, I don't think they utilized it in the best ways possible. But let's go and move on to the next dungeon. And for rank number 14, we have the new version of Winter Outpost. Now keep in mind that I won't be ranking any like legacy dungeons and only just the mainline stuff. So this is not including like boss raids or anything like that. With that being said, the Winter Outpost rework definitely did a lot more for this beloved dungeon. However, I don't think it does enough to warrant any higher places. I think this dungeon is arguably like one of the most linear dungeons in the game and really does not have much to see looking in any other direction. I think the idea of like the dungeon had been better utilized, however I don't think it's good enough to compete with any of the other dungeons. I also think this dungeon for its like level requirement is way too difficult. Yeah, I really think that this dungeon is a bit too hard for newer players, pushing it beyond dungeons like Pirate Island. I also think that the bosses, while looking very cool, are pretty annoying to fight and they have an absurdly high amount of health. And I want to mention that none of the dungeons that are being mentioned in this video are bad by any means. I think every single dungeon in Dungeon Quest is a good dungeon. However, there are obviously like less good dungeons. And this one I just think really is a less good dungeon. But let's go and move on to rank number 13. Now you likely aren't surprised to see that rank number 13 is Orbital Outpost. And before I talk about this dungeon, subscribe, because I'm probably going to be losing a lot of subscribers in this video. But with that being said, Orbital Outpost is not really that great of a dungeon. However, I do think it is unique in a lot of ways, which is why I'm putting it a little bit higher on the list. I think the bosses and enemies are a huge improvement from other dungeons and utilize the creative aspects of space. I especially like just this atmosphere as a whole. However, the dungeon again suffers with a lot of simplicity, which really is not too great with the dungeon. Yeah, you can definitely tell like all of the bricks that were being placed, and I don't know, it just really lacks detail. I also think the lighting and stuff can be boring at times and doesn't really fully embrace the space themes of the dungeon. However, this dungeon really did a lot for its time and really changed things up. And also another huge complaint I would have with this dungeon is its length. I think the length of this dungeon is way too short, and they don't do enough with that short space, comparatively to other dungeons like Enchanted Forest, which are much higher on the list while being still nearly the same size. Overall, this dungeon is not bad, it just really doesn't do enough, and I think it's overly simplistic. But let's move on to number 12. And at number 12, we have the new version of Desert Temple. Now, in terms of upgrades towards the older version of Desert Temple, this is night and day. This dungeon is very, very good when you compare it to the old version of Desert Temple. However, with that being said, I think this dungeon does kind of struggle with the linearity of Winter Outpost, along with the bosses having an absurdly high amount of HP. Yeah, I don't know what's with dungeon reworks and the bosses just having so much HP, but it gets very annoying. I also think that this dungeon is a little bit too short and doesn't really embrace all of the things that it could. However, I absolutely love like all of the detail with this dungeon and all of the different areas, and it's definitely one of the most unique dungeons in the game. Like, you have little sections of this kind of like sand town, and truly this is by no means a bad dungeon. But the bosses, that's probably my biggest complaint, is the bosses just have so much health and it makes it very annoying to play sometimes. But yeah, not a bad dungeon for sure. Now let's move on to spot number 11. And at spot number 11, we have Steampunk Sewers. Now this dungeon does come with a lot of personal bias, so I can see why you'd put this dungeon a little bit lower than where I'm putting it at. But this is a dungeon that I truly love, and I think it really broke the standards for what Dungeon Quest dungeons were, where we were getting all of these very detailed and very grand dungeons. We kind of came back to a like simplistic dungeon. This also changed the theming of dungeons from being more ancient to more kind of like sci-fi dungeon. I also think the enemies and bosses absolutely slap in this dungeon and are not too difficult to fight. This dungeon overall is just very, very great, and I love the transitions from different areas. Like, it shows kind of like this steam factory kind of thing. And this is truly a dungeon that I think can benefit from lacking detail. But bosses like the evil scientists really just changed the way we actually play dungeons. Also, I think the spells as well in this dungeon are very, very great. Having spells like Pulse Waves and Arrow Rain make this dungeon great in my opinion. My biggest complaints would probably be like the camera shake on enemies. However, a lot of people don't like this dungeon, so I gotta be fair. But let's move on to the top 10. At rank number 10, we have Gilded Skies. Now, I want to mention that all of the dungeons to be said from now on are very good dungeons. And I personally think that you could probably switch out any of these for any other ones and still get a relatively accurate ranking. With that, of course, being said, Gilded Skies is a very good dungeon. However, I do think it does struggle with the same issues that a dungeon like the Underworld would. But I think that the theming of this dungeon is super unique and also just does so many cool ideas. But my and many other people's biggest complaints would be how difficult the enemies and bosses are. This dungeon is super difficult and for no reason really. I also think that sections can get a little bit repetitive compared to others. But if I were to rank this really on just personal opinion, I'd probably put this more at like the 5 or 6 slot, because this dungeon is very good. But I do accept that a lot of people don't like this dungeon for fair reasons. Like, this dungeon is very difficult, and also it does kind of suffer with some linearity. A part that I do like is like this winding staircase. This winding staircase is kind of cool. Also, I completely forgot to equip the dungeon cosmetic. Yeah, I have to do this for all of the dungeons, but I will say that the dungeon cosmetic at least looks pretty cool. But yeah, the areas just don't really have too much around them, and it's very kind of straightforward. However, this place looks pretty cool. It's like kind of like a church thing. But yeah, overall, very good dungeon. Now let's move on to rank number 9. And at rank number 9, we have King's Castle. Now this dungeon is the single dungeon that I think holds up the best in Dungeon Quest. This dungeon was made like, what, 4 years ago? 5 years ago? I literally don't even know. But this dungeon holds up so well for its time. And while I think the map does lack a little bit of detail, I think that the idea completely carries it. Going from kind of like this king's kind of courtyard through this bridge area to a little town area, and I'll kind of commentate more as we advance, but this dungeon transitions from area to area in such a good way. And I think the individual set pieces for this dungeon are done brilliantly. And the bosses as well, I think hugely step up any of the dungeons previously seen before, and their ideas are even cooler. I think the main thing that probably carries this dungeon is its idea. And I think that if this dungeon were to get reworked, it could possibly see a spot in the top 3. But even like, look, we're now in kind of this library area fighting an archmage. It is just done so well. And for many people, this is their favorite dungeon. And also, the build up to the final boss is even better. This dungeon with its ideas are just so good. And the king as well. while you have to do a lot of walking, he is a very cool boss. But let's go and move on to spot number 8. And for spot number 8, we have Volcanic Chambers. Now, in its current state, this dungeon would be a lot higher on the list because right now it's just kind of very buggy, but I'm gonna discount the bugs because I think this dungeon really is great. And I think the biggest thing that makes this dungeon good is the enemies and bosses. I think the enemies in this dungeon completely changed up what enemies were meant to be, along with the bosses being extremely difficult but extremely fun. But this dungeon truly makes you feel like a legend whenever you play through it. And the music just cannot be beaten by any other dungeon. The music in this dungeon is so good. But even bosses like the deity of the volcano being very difficult, but having also creative mechanics, like having like patch up those lava holes. But I think also like the art style of this dungeon is one of the best. I would say that probably like the biggest flaw with this dungeon, however, is its linearity and how you're just walking on like platforms above kind of all of the areas. And that's definitely a complaint that I could see people having. But even like the enemies, they're shaped like volcanoes. You have these like walker guys who have very unique attacks. Also, the build up to the final boss is so cool. Yeah, just like this one shot alone should be like an actual trailer. It looks so nice. Well, let's move on to spot number 7. And at spot number 7, we have the Canals. Now, this was at one point my favorite dungeon of all time, and for good reason. This dungeon is really great. Also, I didn't even know, but the cosmetic literally has like a gun on it. That's so cool. But this dungeon really was unique at its time, and still is very unique. Where all of the dungeons were very brightly themed, this dungeon is kind of like a very dark, middle-aged kind of themed dungeon. I think the enemies as well are very difficult, but very fun to fight. And the main thing I love is just how it kind of loops around itself. Yeah, you kind of like re-explore areas that you've seen from different perspectives. And from pretty much any angle, this dungeon looks great. Also, I really like the detail on the water. It looks pretty nice. But bro, what? Oh my gosh, I can't even commentate because we keep getting Greg. It's like every game. But even looking at like the skybox above, it really just is very well fitting with the theme of the dungeon. I would say probably the most underwhelming thing about this dungeon, however, is the bosses. Yeah, the bosses in this dungeon are not great if I'm being honest. But just look at this area, bro. This area looks so nice. You can see like the area you once were at and the different places you traveled across in the map. Yeah, this dungeon really is like one of the least linear dungeons in the entire game, and it just does so many things different. But here we are on the Warrior Overlord, and this is what I mean, like the bosses just aren't really anything too crazy. But let's move on to rank number 6, which is my personal favorite dungeon, and that dungeon is of course the Aquatic Temple. Now this dungeon is my favorite dungeon in all of Dungeon Quest, and I think that the huge thing that this dungeon does well is its enemies. This dungeon has some of the best enemies in all of Dungeon Quest, and some of the most difficult ones. Like, you have these Titan guys, you have kind of like these robotic guys as well. It is just a cool dungeon when it comes to enemies and boss. But I just really love like the different shades of blue that this uses, and of course the water all around the dungeon. I can fully accept why a lot of people wouldn't like this dungeon, which is why I'm not placing this at 1. But yeah, truly this dungeon is like a mix of Orbital Outpost and Ghastly Harbor to make one absolutely grand dungeon. I also love that from different viewpoints you can see like all of the area that you traveled. Like, I could see the very start from here, and I can also see areas up ahead. I also love how this dungeon feels very big compared to you, which allows you to see kind of far out. But yeah, even from this perspective, you could see like the starting area way over there, and you can also see the end. But yeah, climbing up this tower area is very fun. And this boss as well, the bosses in this dungeon are so creative. I'll admit that they're extremely difficult, but they are fun to fight. But look at this, like look, you're literally like walking up the staircase to heaven, bro. Just like the set pieces in this dungeon are so cool. Definitely my all-time favorite dungeon, but I can see the reasons why you wouldn't like it. But let's move on to spot number 5, which is the top 5 slots. And for spot number 5, we have Samurai Palace. Now, I know this is probably going to be a pretty controversial one, as a lot of you guys probably wanted me to put this in like top 3. And I'm just gonna say this right now, I really think the thing that's holding this dungeon back is its enemies and bosses, as they are not really that great compared to other dungeons. With that being said, this dungeon is absolutely breathtaking. Every single area in this dungeon is so beautiful, and it's just definitely one of the most scenic dungeons in the game. I also love the samurai themes of this dungeon, as it fits very nicely with kind of the atmosphere. Like, just look at this area. You can see all ahead of the dungeon, and you can just see how beautiful this dungeon really is. I think for its time, this dungeon really exceeded all expectation, with some of the best lighting, map design, and music of all of Dungeon Quest. I also love the set pieces of the bosses. I don't particularly love the bosses, but you know, this kind of ancient Golem Guardian is kind of like in this rocky area, and the boss we previously fought was kind of in like this samurai war room. And similarly to Aquatic Temple, I love how you can see ahead of the dungeon by a long ways. And I really don't think a single person in this entire game hates this dungeon, because there's really not much to hate. This dungeon is great, and I fully understand why you would say that this is your favorite dungeon in the game, because truly it is a great dungeon. However, the only thing I think holds it back is its bosses and enemies. But let's move on to spot number 4, which is one of my personal favorite dungeons. That dungeon is, of course, Ghastly Harbor. Now, there is a little bit of a bug with this dungeon that Volcanic Chambers also struggles with, which is how the map isn't really loading in some areas. However, I'm not going to really include that in my rating. But this dungeon, I would say, has the best atmosphere of every dungeon in the entire game. I think for its theme, this dungeon does an amazing job at really fitting that, with kind of like this cursed pirate-like dungeon, really kind of mixing themes from the Underworld and a dungeon like Pirate Island. But really what I love most about this dungeon is how you travel through it, kind of descending from like these upper platforms and these upper buildings down this cave area and to this kind of like town. This dungeon transitions in such an amazing way. Now, the sole reason why I put this dungeon above Samurai Palace is its bosses. This dungeon might have some of the best bosses in all of Dungeon Quest. Yeah, especially bosses like the Kraken and other dungeons seen a little bit later. Also, the enemies and stuff are very cool as well. But you can even see, you can like look back and see all of the progress that you made, and you can see even further throughout the entire dungeon. Now, the one small complaint that I can think of with this dungeon is that it's a little bit too difficult without speed spells, and you'll be struggling a lot if you do not have like 2 mighty leaps or something. But even the music in this dungeon, oh my gosh, like the music in this dungeon is so good, competing with a dungeon like Volcanic Chamber. This dungeon truly just embraces all of the pirate themes that a dungeon can have, being like a direct upgrade to a dungeon like Pirate Island. Also, I didn't even know, but they added like a bunch of cool effects from when you actually attack enemies. That's pretty nice. But look at this view. You could see the start area. You could see every single place you've traveled through. It's just so nice. Also, this build up to the Sea Serpent where you're kind of climbing up this mountain is even better in my opinion. Yeah, if only the loading issues were fixed, this dungeon, oh my gosh, would be so good. But let's go and move on to the top 3 spot, which is the best of the best when it comes to dungeon. And for spot number 3, we have Northern Lands. Now, this dungeon is as good as a winter dungeon can get. Truly, this is like Winter Outpost but on crack. This dungeon is so good. I think especially the enemies and bosses hugely step up any of the other dungeons that I've previously talked about. And also, this dungeon is just so unique. Like, we have kind of like this icy area we kind of advance through. It's more of like a bright themed version of Winter Outpost, but so much better. Yeah, this dungeon takes on some like Viking, almost medieval themes, which make it hugely better. And the bosses, the armors, the enemies embrace this very well. Like, even this cosmetic, it makes me feel like a very strong warrior. And the music as well. I know I keep talking about music with these dungeons, but it's so important, and this one just does it so well. Again, this dungeon does suffer with a little bit of loading issues, but I'm not going to really talk about that too much. But even this area where you like jump down from these platforms, it really makes you feel like a warrior. And I think the sole thing that's putting this dungeon above other dungeons is that this dungeon does something very unique, and I'll talk about it when I get to that area. But just the snow everywhere, it is just such a good dungeon. But yeah, you can even see the northern lights if you look up. Every like minute detail was covered in this dungeon. Also, I think the build up to the final boss is probably the best of any dungeon in the game, and especially his little set piece is very cool as well. I think the biggest issue with this dungeon is probably its difficulty. But yeah, the reason why this dungeon is above other dungeons is because it has a bonus boss that you can fight, and And this, I think, is an idea that should have been used in other dungeons. Like, yeah, you can now fight Odin Reincarnation, which is a completely separate boss from the other 3. And also, this dungeon has, like, ultimate weapons and stuff, which is pretty cool. So yeah, definitely deserving of a top 3 spot. Like, look, I literally get 6 items. It doesn't even fit inside the box. That's kind of funny. Well, for number 2 on the list, we have Enchanted Forest. Now, I think most of us could probably agree that this dungeon is top 3. I mean, this dungeon just exceeds every other one in its detail, in its theme, in almost every aspect of it. Like, this dungeon is probably the most detailed dungeon in the game, if not for the next one I'm going to talk about. But like, all of the individual blades of grass, all of like the different neon lights on these parts really develop a theme of this dungeon that I absolutely love. I think this dungeon is even more beautiful than Samurai Palace because it just does so much different. The bosses as well are some of the most creative ones. I'm actually going to stick to just this boss because he does have safe zones and stuff, but he also has this really cool mechanic where you have to like build a wall to protect him from attacking you, which I think is just so unique and just so cool. Yeah, while this dungeon is short, it absolutely is just breathtaking. And in every direction, you can see a new thing to do. But just even like looking at this area right here, this dungeon, it's exceptional. The one thing that isn't exceptional about this dungeon though is its cosmetic. This stuff looked kind of goofy. I mean, just even look up that skybox and just everything. Oh my gosh, I can't stop simping for this dungeon because it's so good. And the final boss, if you guys haven't seen him already, the final boss really just solidifies this at being the second best in the game. To be honest, I could see an argument for why this dungeon is better than first place, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Also, oh my, like how much am I gonna get Greg in this dungeon? Greg, you're not a part of this dungeon, bro. Also, I got 3 materials. Hold up. That isn't even the focus of this. But look at, like, bro, we have a tree boss. How could a dungeon be bad if we have a literal tree as a boss? But despite this dungeon being short, it feels massive. And really, there's beauty in every direction with this dungeon. But the best part about this dungeon is the Enchanted Forest Dragon. A dragon boss was something that players have been looking for such a long time, and this dungeon delivered. I think this is actually one of like the icons for this game just because of how cool this boss is. And his design isn't even really the best part. His attacks are very fun and really satisfying to dodge. And not to mention the music. Like, the music in this dungeon beats out most other dungeons. But man, let's move on to spot number 1, which I'm sure you could probably already anticipate what it is. And that dungeon is, of course, the final one being Yokai Peak. Now, while the theme isn't as good as Enchanted Forest, I think this dungeon hugely steps up Enchanted Forest for the way that it transitions themes. I think this dungeon does the best job at really changing themes from place to place. Like, keep in mind, we're currently in kind of like this water forest area, but soon it will change, and it just keeps on changing over and over again in this dungeon. And that's probably the biggest praise I can give it. But also the lighting as well. Look at this lighting, bro. This lighting in itself is just so good. You can see that the first boss was built on kind of like the first theme being kind of like a water theme. And yeah, I really think that this dungeon is just like a longer and better version of Enchanted Forest in a lot of ways. Passing the first boss, you'll see the first theme change, which goes from like this water area to kind of like a forest play. And you can see that the monsters completely change up. This is a very unique idea to dungeon quest that hadn't been seen when VCafe was a developer. But you can see we kind of like go up these stairs and explore this like forest area. And the lighting, I'd have to say that the lighting in this dungeon is probably the best of any other. I know I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate for putting this one at number 1 because I know this dungeon is hated by a lot of players, but I think that a lot of you guys will soon appreciate this dungeon as more start to come out, because usually on release, dungeons are not too loved a lot of the time. And this dungeon does have a lot of flaws, but I think its pros just completely outweigh it. But now the second boss is kind of revolved around like this forest kind of area. And also, I think this is where my cosmetic is actually inspired. Yeah, this dungeon doesn't have like a dungeon cosmetic, which is a little bit of a flaw with it. But you can see kind of the second theme change going from a forest area to this kind of like samurai place. This I absolutely love about the dungeon. And you can see now that we're fighting like samurai bosses, like yokai people. It's just so well thought out and how it changes. It's like absolutely amazing. You can also see like a bunch of buildings. You can see these two like floating places. But there's this dungeon as well. Definitely, I think like the longest dungeon in the game, and utilizes its theme super well. You can see we're kind of like on this boss area, more based on like a samurai theme. I also think that the bosses and enemies in this dungeon are very creative, going back to the older style of monsters seen in dungeons like Orbital Outpost. However, I think it does advance it pretty well, which makes it very good. But another thing this dungeon does very unique is that it actually has a fourth boss, and this is where you see your fourth theme change, which is into like this kind of fiery area. This dungeon just changes themes so much, and I really love it. And Sarugami as well is just a very cool boss. Like, this dungeon, it really doesn't do much wrong. But with that, the final dungeon boss has been defeated. But ladies and gentlemen, I have another video on the screen for you guys, so definitely go check it out. And also, this is all my personal opinion, but I tried to make it as accurate as possible. So yeah, don't be too upset if your favorite dungeon got a little bit higher on the list. But for now, I'll see you guys later.